So maybe you've just finished constructing your project, or you bought a chair like this unfinished. It's time now to put the finish on it, and that's where the little demons come out. Well, it's a relatively easy process if we take it in 3 steps, and we're going to show you how to do that. The first step is in prepping it, where we'll talk about sanding. The second step is in putting a color on it, like staining, and the third step is putting a top coat, and in this case we'll probably use polyurethane. We're going to really increase the confidence level you'll have when you do a project like this after you've seen what we're going to show you. And now let's show you step 1. Now your preparation begins very basically with sandpaper. And maybe we should take just a minute or two to talk about sandpaper. You're going to find when you start sanding that you'd like to choose the correct grit. In this case we're going to start with 120 grit, a little bit more coarse than 240, and let me explain. When you see the numbers on here, in this case 120, in this case 240, it talks about the grit size. 120 is a much more coarse grit than is 240. So we want to start with 120 and start our sanding that way and work our way through maybe 150, then 180 to 220 or 240. So that's what you see in the first part. The second part is whether or not this is open or closed coat. Now an open coat, it just means the grains are a little bit further apart, allows the sawdust to fall out while you're sanding so that sandpaper doesn't become clogged. And the last thing you may notice on the paper is weight. In this case, the paperweight A is a relatively flexible, smaller, thinner sheet. Paperweight C is a little bit heavier. Both of those are appropriate when you're doing sanding. Now, one more thing to add, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more during our finish section, is papers that go up starting from about 400 to 1500 grit. And these, the grits, as the numbers get bigger, the grits get even finer. This will allow you to sand either between coats of finish or actually do a rub out on your final coat of finish. So now your choice is how you're going to do your sanding. There's a couple different options. The first is just to fold the sandpaper and use it by hand like you see here. The second is to use a sand pad. And on long, broad surfaces, in a lot of cases, it's a good idea to use a pad. And there's a lot of different types. It's a good idea to kind of look around, see which ones fit your hands well. And the third way to do it, especially on larger, bigger projects, maybe to use a power sander. And you see one here, this is a little pad sander. They work really well. The one option I would give you is this one's got a bag on the side of it, which does a nice job collecting dust. But if I have the opportunity anytime, I'll try and use a vacuum hose. So this you can remove and put a vacuum hose on it. It's just a lot more efficient way to take the dust out. And lastly, if you're sensitive to sawdust, and maybe even all the time, it's a good idea to wear a dust mask like this. It really helps keep the dust out of your lungs and it'll make the sanding a little bit more pleasurable. Now on this chair, the surface is relatively smooth, but on your project it may be a little bit rougher. In either case, it's nice to start out with 120 grit paper. So what we'll do is we'll start with 120 and go over this entire chair by sanding evenly on all these surfaces. And it's very important to make sure that all the surfaces are sanded to 120 before you move up in grits. Now after you finish sanding with 120 grit sandpaper, you're fairly comfortable, you've sanded everything on the chair, it's time to switch to 150. Again, remember we're going to work our way from 120 to 150 to 220 as we work up. After I'm done with my 120, a little bit of this 120 grit, fairly coarse grit, is still lying on the chair. It's important, especially when you're using your hand and sandpaper like this, to follow up that 120 grit with a vacuum hose attachment. And just vacuum that off a little bit. That way you don't have some of that bigger grit sitting on there, so that when you start with your 150 grit sandpaper, you're not rubbing that 120 grit, the one that was previously there, back into the surface again. It really makes that job go easier and the chair gets smoother quicker. Now here's a tip for you. We're planning on ultimately putting some stain on this chair, and it's really important that the end grain, and you'll see it here on the end of this chair as opposed to the side grain or maybe the top, the end grain is always more porous. And it's going to attract an awful lot of stain and really darken the looks of this. So what I'll do is use finer sandpapers beyond the 220 to sand just that end grain. My thinking is if you have 220 here, do twice the grit. So go up to 320 and then finally 400 grit sandpaper and sand just the end grain. This additional sanding will reduce the porosity in here and make this edge look a lot more like the surface after stain is put on. And one more thing. Sandpaper does wear out. Every once in a while you're going to have to break down and use a new piece of sandpaper. You'll be surprised how much faster this job will go if you'll just change it every once in a while. One last thing I want to show you, and that's cleaning up the chair in general. My favorite is to take the hose that comes with your vacuum or maybe even your shop vac and actually use that little brush on the end to vacuum up all the loose dust. It does a really nice job of taking the residual dust off the surface of that chair. For those of you that have one, a blowgun in your compressor also does a very nice job removing the dust and does a remarkable job removing dust, especially in end grain. There are a couple of things that people will read about using either a tack rag like this or maybe mineral spirits on a rag. And I'd like to talk about two of those issues. Using mineral spirits on a rag I think works well between coats of finish. When you're using it on raw wood, I think all it does is make the wood wet. You will have to re-wet it quite a bit and keep changing that pad to make sure that you're not just moving the dust around. I think vacuuming is a better bet. If you're going to use a tack rag, make sure that the tack rag is used extremely lightly, almost as though you were just lightly passing over the top of this. The more pressure you put on this tack rag can take some of the chemicals that are in this rag, the ones that you feel on your fingers when you're using it, and actually transfer that to the surface of the wood. Those are not a good thing to have when you're trying to put a stain or finish on. So again, my preference would be just use the vacuum attachment on either your vacuum or your shop vac and vacuum this off. In part one, we talked about sanding this chair and getting it ready to put some color on it. And in part two, the color we're going to use comes from stain. My personal favorite is oil-based stain. I like it because it doesn't fade, goes on very easily, and provides much more flexibility when you're putting on top coats. This is also the time to think about the finishing process. I feel that the finishing process should take at least as long as it did to construct your furniture. This is not the time to rush. When you're putting on a stain, you're also going to find that it's nice to use a small sample piece to make sure that the stain matches the color that you're looking for and also goes on well without blotching. Because this is a purchase product, this is a chair that I bought for this, I found that I don't have any of that scrap. But there is a good place to find a test area on this chair, and let me show you where that is. Now here on the bottom of the chair is the perfect place to do a test. No one will ever see this. The wood is the same as the wood used to the rest of the chair, and you'll be able to tell whether or not the stain goes on well, whether or not it blotches, and some of the other issues that go with it. Perfect spot. What I'll always do to keep from having a problem with the stain leaking all over the place is take an awl and punch a couple of small holes around the inside ring of that can. That will allow any of the stain that kind of comes up in there to leak back in. And don't worry about it, it won't affect the seal. The seal's on the outside and inside edges, it's not in the bottom of that. Now I want you to stir the stain, and I want to stir it well because stain is pigment based, the oil is, and hopefully you'll be able to see this is what the pigment looks like sitting at the bottom of that can. And it's important to make sure that that pigment is well stirred so it's in suspension and it's not sitting in the bottom. All right, so we're all done during the stirring here. As you can see, there's no pigments left at the bottom of this stick. And now we'll talk about a couple of different application methods or tools. The first is a rag. A lot of people like to use this, no problem at all. Second is a foam brush. Picks up an awful lot of material, lays out an awful lot of material at one time, actually works fairly well. And the last is what they call a chip brush. This does a real nice job and kind of blends the three techniques together. And you can use them separately or all together, and to be honest, in many cases I wind up using all three of them. All right, now to do a little test sample on the bottom of this chair, I'm going to take the stain. In this case I'm going to use the brush. There's an awful lot of little areas in here that make it tough to use just a rag. And I'm going to real lightly put a couple of lines of finish in here. As soon as I put them on, I'll take a rag and wipe them down a bit just so I can see whether or not the stain is penetrated well. And this then brings up a little discussion. If the stain penetrates perfectly and if it looks nice and even across, although remember there are different boards in here so it's not going to look perfect, as long as it looks fairly even, I'm going to stay with that technique. If it turns out that the boards themselves are taking in an awful lot of stain in one spot and not in another, that's called blotching. And what I may want to do is change my technique there. There are two different ways to do that. One is to use a gel stain, which will help reduce some of that blotching. The second is to condition the wood by using what they call a wood conditioner, and then use a stain over the top of that. We'll give you a little bit more information about those later. But what I'm going to do right now is just use the stain. As you can see, the finish looks pretty good. comes out pretty evenly, and I'm pretty comfortable that what happened on the bottom of this chair is also going to happen on the sides. So now that I'm done, I'll turn the chair over and let's start working on the real surface. Okay, now you'll continue to stain this chair and use the same techniques that you used on the sample side. Remember the bottom side of this chair seat. But I want to show you a couple things. When you stain the top of this, you get a nice look. But as you come around the face, remember that end grain problem being a little bit more porous than the surface. What I asked you to do in video 1 was to double sand. So we sanded this to 220, we're sanding the front of this to 320 and then to 400. The stain on here, because this has been sanded a little bit finer, should approximate the look on the top. So we'll put the stain on here. Now one of the application methods is to put it across the grain along and wipe it with the grain. It's a good idea to go back and forth to give a nice even coverage. And I'll wipe this off, and then I want to go across the face of this and show you how nicely we'll get this blend between a stained edge that's been sanded to 220 and an end grain that's been sanded to 400. Look at how nice the color is here and how much lighter it is here. If this had not been sanded to 400 grit, it would have been markedly darker and you'd see a pronounced line across that end grain. Really nice blend. We're putting a little stain on the leg side here, and you're feeling pretty comfortable about your abilities. And then when you go to wipe it off, you find something like this. Now that's a glue spot. Usually looks like a fingerprint, surprisingly enough. And what happens is you didn't pick that up when you first looked at your chair and did all your sanding. This is not the time to panic. Take a razor knife like this. Actually use that razor knife and sand off the glue on that spot instead of trying to come back with it with sandpaper. And let's see what that looks like. And there you go. Now it's nice to be able to find a technique to remove that glue spot after the fact, but to be honest, you're much better off to try and find them before you start putting stain on. Generally what I do when I build a project is I'll take a little mineral spirits on a rag and I'll wipe the entire project down with it. Glue shows up very well with mineral spirits over the top as a slight shiny area because the mineral spirits couldn't penetrate in that spot. Allow the mineral spirits to dry, sand that area, and re-tap it with mineral spirits until you finally find the glue is gone. That way when you're staining a project, you don't get surprised. Okay, now you've finished staining your chair. Let me give you a couple of more pointers here. If you find that after the stain is on here that it's just a little bit darker than you wanted in a couple of spots, this is an oil-based stain. So just take a little bit of mineral spirits while the stain is still wet, real lightly wipe over those spots and you will have light in that color. If you want the color a little darker, it's important to let this dry overnight. Give it a good 6 or 8 hours of drying and come back and apply the second coat of stain the same as you did the first. Oil-based stains penetrate very well. The odds are that you won't need much more than a second coat to darken it. And finally, before putting on a top coat, allow this to dry at least 24 hours. Temperature and humidity conditions change a lot. It also changes the guidelines associated with drying times. Let it dry 24 hours to make sure that you're not going to have a problem with applying a top coat to it. And lastly, from a safety standpoint, the rags that you use to wipe off this stain, if left in a ball like this, can cause a problem. They will self-combust. So open the rag up, let it air dry, and when it's finally dry and hard, then you can throw it away. You should be feeling pretty proud of yourself right now after following the techniques that we gave you and doing the staining that you did. But the process isn't over. It's time to put on a finish coat, and we'll show you how to do that. In part 1, we talked about sanding the chair and kind of preparing it for the stain we were going to put on. In the second one, we gave you what we think are a lot of good ideas on putting stain on, and you should feel pretty good about the chair that you've got. The third part of this now is finishing, actually putting a protective and beautifying top coat on. This is where you may start getting a little nervous, but I've got a lot of great ideas for you, and we'll make this process easy so that your confidence level just soars. The first thing is to choose a finish that's going to go on here. Now I've assembled 4 of the more popular ones, and I think what I'd like to do is take you through each one to show you what they're like. The first is shellac. It's an old-time finish, very popular, goes on easily. You can actually control its color by adding some colorants to it. It has a okay resistance to wear and moisture. The second finish is lacquer, a little bit more protective than shellac. Beautiful finish, extremely clear, dries very fast. The third finishes, kind of taken as a group here, are polyurethanes. Extremely protective, very, very good finishes. The first is water-based. Water-based finish dries quickly. It has no real fumes, so that those exposed to the fumes in there won't really be bothered by them. And I think you'll find that the finish that goes on is extremely clear. It does not highlight the grain at all, so I kind of like using it on maples, but it's a beautiful finish. And our fourth finish is oil-based polyurethane, and the one that I've chosen for this chair. A very soft, kind of a warm golden glow to it will accentuate the colors in this chair, and the protective ability is far beyond any of the ones that you see here. So these are the four finishes. We're going to use oil-based poly on this one. Now, concerning the application of these products, these can be brushed on. They can also be sprayed on through the cans like this. You can also spray them if you're lucky enough to have an HVLP sprayer out of an HVLP sprayer gun, or they can be wiped on. We've chosen to brush our finishes on, and I want to show you the brush selections that you now can make. Now here's a selection that I want to kind of talk about when you're applying a finish. If you remember just a minute ago I talked to you about wipe-on poly. I like to use a little rag like this, a clean lint-free rag to wipe on poly. You can also wipe on some of the regular poly, but it's a little bit tougher, it's a little bit thicker in this can than wipe on. But when I'm applying regular polyurethane, you have four choices. The first is a foam brush. A lot of people like foam brushes. They're relatively inexpensive. I like them in that they hold a lot of material, but at the same time they have a tendency to leave a lot of material on the surface of the finish. So for that reason, I really don't use these terribly often. And foam brushes also have a tendency to create little bubbles in the finish, which from polyurethane is a tough thing. Second type of brush, and you'll find a lot of these at the store, and a lot of people like them because they're so inexpensive. This is called a chip brush. Chip brushes for removing chips from lathes and equipment like that, really not meant to put on a finish. So I would suggest that even though they're inexpensive, skip it. The third type of brush is a nylon bristle brush. It is used for putting on water-based finishes. We use nylon with water-based finishes because water has a tendency to swell the fibers of these brushes. With a nylon bristle brush, that won't happen. But in the case of our oil-based polyurethane, my favorite brush, and the one that I use all the time, is a natural bristle. This holds an awful lot of material. It has an inordinate number of bristles on the end, each with splayed ends that have a tendency to really lay out a beautiful finish and do it evenly. So this is my choice for putting on a polyurethane finish. Okay, let's start the process of applying the polyurethane. First we'll open up the can. And what I want to do is I'm going to punch a couple of holes in this can. I'm going to punch them on the inside edge of this ring. And just do it with an awl. That way as you stir this and as you use the finish, that finish that runs over the outside edges can drip back in the can again. If it doesn't drip back in the can, or if you don't have those holes, there's no way to put a seal on there and guarantee a real nice tight fit. So that's what we've done first. And the second thing is, we're going to stir this, and here's why. At the bottom of this can sits a good amount of material that needs to be stirred in well. You'll see it on here. The more flattened the finish is, if this is a semi-gloss or a satin gloss, you'll have even more of these agents at the bottom. So it's important now to stir these and make sure that they're well distributed. And while you're putting on this finish, especially if it takes a couple of hours to apply this finish, go back occasionally and re-stir. Again, with the object in that you want to make sure that all of the elements of this finish are in suspension and not sitting on the bottom. Now it's time to apply the finish to this chair, and much like we did with the stain, we'd like to try it in an inconspicuous place just to make sure that that's the finish that we're looking for. So again, we're going to turn this chair over, use the bottom section to apply the finish, and whenever you start putting a finish on, in particular polyurethane, I'll take the brush. Polyurethane is mineral spirits based, so I put a quantity of mineral spirits in this container, and I'm going to dip the brush in this real fast, kind of shake off the excess, because what I'm interested in is kind of getting this brush not only ready to put a finish on, but also to have some thinner down into the collar around the outside, which will make it a whole lot easier to clean. You remember I told you to spend $15 or $20 on a brush. This is a great way to make that easier to clean when you're done. Let's dip the brush in the finish, only come up about 1/3 the way on the sides, tap the edges, don't roll up against the edges, and we're going to make our first layer of finish on the bottom edge of this chair. So I'm just adding a nice even coat of finish here first. And then I'm going to show you a little technique that's called tipping off. And that will take the somewhat irregular paint strokes that you see now and begin the self-leveling process that works so well with polyurethane. Now, with no additional finish in the brush, I'm going to just take this brush and holding it almost vertically. It's a process called tipping off. All I want to do is drag that brush very gently over the surface of that finish. And again, this tipping off process will take areas of finish that were a little bit too thick or a little bit too thin and level them so that the natural self-leveling can take over. Don't overwork this, just that real quick stroke, and that's called tipping off. Now, as I start putting finish on the top surface of this chair, I want to talk to you about the second problem that comes in with applying polyurethane. The first, the brush strokes, we took care of that with tipping off, and I showed you that technique. The second problem is the occurrence of bubbles. And there's a few different ways to eliminate or greatly reduce those bubbles. The first is make sure that you stir the can of finish, don't shake it. Don't add any more bubbles than were already there. The second is don't run the brush over the edge of that can an awful lot because that causes a lot of bubbles to be formed. The third is slow down the application speed with your brush. The slower you go, the better. Faster application speeds generates turbulence, and that equates to bubbles. And the fourth is, when the weather gets really cool, the viscosity of that substance gets a little bit thick. You may want to thin it with some mineral spirits. That will help it flow easier and greatly reduce the possibility of bubbles. That original coat that we put down there and allow to dry gives you a couple of different indications. The first is whether or not you like the looks of that finish, and the second, and probably more importantly, is how well that finish dried. What I would suggest is that when you start a project like this, and maybe you've spent a couple of $100s on material, don't decide to kind of cheap out on the finish. If this can is more than a couple of years old, or if it's 3/4 away empty, I would suggest that you start with a fresh can. A fresh can of finish has a tendency to flow better and dry quicker and harder. Don't give up the ability of a finish to work well because you've tried to save a little bit of money on an old can of finish. Now we've arrived at the time where you've put your first coat on and it's time to put succeeding coats of finish on. A couple of different things here to keep in mind. The first is, please make sure that this finish has had plenty of time to dry. Again, I will probably give at least 24 hours between coats of finish just to make sure that there's no problems in drying. Remember, temperature and humidity have a lot to do with drying times. Make it 24 hours and eliminate that potential. When we do this work, we're going to use closed coat sandpaper. And if you remember, the grits on the closed coat are a little bit closer together. It's a finer paper, in this case 400 grit. And I'm going to real lightly sand with the grain, and you should see a very fine white haze forming. And that's a good thing. It means the surface of this polyurethane is hardened sufficiently to allow me to real lightly sand off any of these little imperfections that you may have missed during any of the previous coats. So again, very gently with the grain all over the entire surface. Now that we've done that, we have an extremely smooth, very soft surface that I have to remove the dust on. To remove the fine white dust left after sanding, some people like to use a tack rag, and I would prefer that you didn't do that. The components of this tack rag will sometimes leave a residue on the finish, which will make it hard to put a second coat of poly on it. I would prefer that you use mineral spirits. I'm going to take a rag moistened with a little bit of mineral spirits. And I'm going to go over the top of this chair and remove all that dust. Now that the chair is completely dry, and it is now dust-free, it's time to put on that next coat of poly. And make sure that you add this coat of poly the same as you did the previous ones. Again, very gentle, long strokes, and at the end of those, your tip off to remove any potential brush marks or strokes. So here's your finished chair. You should be pretty proud of yourself right now. You've gained an awful lot of skill and a lot of confidence that should allow you to tackle almost any project. Remember too that this is a marathon. This isn't a sprint. This project should take you as long to put a finish on as it did to construct it. And if you spend the time doing your prep work, then your staining work, and your finishing work, and the steps that we gave you, you'll be thrilled with the accomplishment. I think this turned out pretty well, and I think it would look great in your home. Now get busy finishing something.